Welcome to this event. It's part of the International Mediation Awareness Week. What our efforts are this week around the world is to raise awareness of mediation and the benefits of mediation for individuals and organisations to help prevent conflict and disputes from escalating. I'm Joanne Law, and my colleagues Matt Lockwood and Nicole Morton are going to be making this presentation. And any other mediators here, we'd love your input as we go through if you've got some experience about the context, and also any of the participants who are part of a community organisation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of this country, of Australia, and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Aboriginal people have thrived on this continent for millennia, longer than the volcanoes have been active here. They've had a really rich and complex social structure that included dispute resolution practices and protocols, with a really strong emphasis on dialogue, clearly articulated laws and practices, and restorative practice. So it actually has a lot of application for what we're talking about today, and particularly in terms of disputes within community organisations and within the people that we serve. I'd like to hand over to you now, Matt, for an introduction of who ICDRS is.
Thanks, Joanne. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for your time. We are ICDRS. What an acronym that is. It's Interact Community Dispute Resolution Service. What does it mean? We're a group of volunteers. We're all mediators, and we do two things. We provide mediation services for anyone who otherwise wouldn't be able to access mediation at low cost, sometimes no cost. And we also do community training as well. So that's who we are. There's three of us here today, but there's a lot more people. There's a lot of faces and names that have put a lot of energy and learning into what we're able to present today and what we do today. We're all helpers. So the benefits of what we do is we're helping others. We get a kick out of obviously doing the mediation, but we know that there's a lot of community organisations out there that are heart and soul of the planet sometimes, and we get a lot of benefit from helping those who help others. So that's a little bit about who we are. Today's format is about conflict, entrenched conflict in community organisations. So the premise is that you're either a community organisation or you work with one, you might be a mediator, but we're going to run through some basics. What is conflict? What are the symptoms? What are the costs of it in our little community organisations? And then we're really going to throw towards you, and we'll share with it, well, what are the recipes for success here in managing that conflict? What our training is for organisations around what we do. And then please continue to hold on, because towards the end, we'll give you some really good practical governance tips, things that you can do now, because it's easy to do these things now when there's no conflict. And often what we experience is that when the conflict is there and it's big, we always wish that we had looked at that a little bit sooner. So I hope that sounds okay. I'm going to just start with just a little bit of chat. Thank you so much from those who've joined us. Trinidad, Brisbane, Canberra, that's wonderful. What is conflict? Pop in the chat. What is it that you observe? What do you see, hear or feel when you experience conflict, whether it be in your community organisation or your workplace? While you're doing the chat, I'll just share a little story with you. So the task here in the chat, what is conflict? What does it look like? What do you see, feel or hear? When we started with ICDRS, we went out into community organisations. We've got an awesome find.
Stress and uneasiness.
What are the symptoms? So really, see, hearing and feeling, they are more or less symptoms. So I guess if we go to something we prepared a little bit earlier, we see lots and lots of things. Lack of dialogue. People in conflict don't want to talk to one another. There's something we see a lot. Miscommunication. We have the same matters coming up over and over again. Naturally, there's heightened emotions. or there can be people drained and withdrawn as well. So all these are symptoms of conflict that we have a look. And if we just click along, I'll just keep progressing. We're just setting up our basics here for the basic little framework. What does it cost us? And the spoiler alert here, what organisations tell us is that the biggest thing, or one of the things, is that people leave. So you have a member, really important people, and what happens is that people go. That does not to say that there's not other costs involved. If we click along here to the next one, this is from the cost survey. I can't quite get the acronym right. What was the acronym? It was
Australian Community Services Sector Survey, which is done by the Australian Council of Social Services annually. So it's a very large survey of community sector organisations. And some of the data we've used in this presentation is coming from that of the sorts of issues that are causing stress to people who are out there doing the good work.
Yeah, it's a pretty good survey as well. The data behind the survey supports what we observe and what we see. When we talk about the effects of conflict, I don't need to read out the slide, but I'd like to focus on there's a real financial cost here. We're people, we're carers, so we really feel for the human side of it. That can be the mental health issues, the physical issues. The organisation we worked with recently, the stress and pressure that people can feel can't be underestimated here. This person had 30 years of building and doing in this organisation, like 30 years, literally a lifetime. We were brought in as mediators, which was lovely, but I guess it just speaks to the effects of conflict. And it sets us up for why we think this is an important conversation. Before we go to the next slide, I will ask for another chat. We've talked about what are the symptoms, what are the effects, what it looks like, what it feels like. What are the sources of conflict in a community organisation?
And Matt, I'll just talk rather than type.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, so I work for a peak body that supports neighbourhood houses and community organisations across Victoria. In an HR capacity, we support organisations throughout. And one of the biggest sources of conflict is when roles are not clarified and people aren't clear on what they need to do, because all of these independent organisations, your local neighbourhood house, your local community centre, they are run by volunteer boards, and that sometimes it's well-meaning individuals who might not have the skills or the understanding of what the roles are, and then the role between governance, which falls to the volunteer committee, and management operations of the organisation, which falls to the appointed manager, the lines get blurred. And when there's no clarity, that often leads to conflict.
Very, very much. Thank you. That is exactly the sort of thing that we see. I notice we've got Simone here from the UK. Are you noticing over there similar sorts of issues? Feel free.
Yes, good. I don't know, what time is it? Good evening to everyone. Yes, definitely. Yes.
Yeah.
Same sort of issues, high turnover, conflict amongst staff and fellow mediators and trustees. Yep.
Yeah. Absolutely. And anyone else got any other thoughts? I see some comments in the chat around the differences, uncertainty, lack of role clarity. Again, yes, very similar. So I think I'm taking the baton for a little bit, Matt.
Oh, just in a little moment, just a couple more points to add. A couple more points to add, if I may. This is the prepared answers, and unclear roles and resolution was very much up there. And just before I hand over the baton, I just thought you'll be able to talk to these a little bit more, but this sets us up now for our next part, which is we've looked at what are the symptoms, what does it look like, what are our effects, what are the sources, and then we'll go on to where this relates to you. So, Joanne, when you look at that list, you've got some old favourites there.
These answers weren't really asking about conflict. The survey was asking about what are the issues, the major issues, and we've put our lens as dispute resolution professionals across it, I suppose. So that point that you raised, Sonia, is number one. Ineffective governance arrangements leading to unclear roles, and certainly from our perspective, dispute resolution approaches. So many of our organisations have, by their very constitution, a requirement that roles rotate or change or people come and go. And so organisational knowledge is difficult to retain in terms of how do we resolve things, how do we do things, and people sometimes, if we don't know something, sometimes we make it up. Resource scarcity, it's a perennial problem for most of the sector. There's never really enough money to go around to do all the things that we want to do. And unfortunately, sometimes that creates internal competition as organisations are competing for funds to run parts of the organisation, to run their pet projects, or they're competing with their partner organisations as well. So we often see that between organisations that maybe have come together to run a project or something, but there are problems happening there. And of course, the communication problems, that happens where there are people. It doesn't matter what place we come together, there's always going to be those sorts of communication and personality clashes. And I suppose one of the things we want to draw out is it's not disputes and conflict, they're part of life. There's always going to be tension between competing needs, points of view. It's how they're dealt with that will determine whether they're a source of growth and rejuvenation and benefit for an organisation, or whether they're corrosive and destructive and causing harm. Where there are people, there's often going to be different and conflicts. And of course, the whole world has just experienced a massive trauma event with COVID, and it's still very close to us. We're all carrying to a lesser or greater degree a trauma burden from that, whether it's vicarious trauma from the things we saw or heard about, or more personal from the loss of loved ones that we couldn't be there for, or whatever. There seems to be a lot less tolerance and patience. Anyone, whatever occupation, education, airline steward, anyone I've talked to is saying that they're experiencing that. So we're in a time where it's a little bit harder than it probably normally would be. Anyway, how does that all fit together? And I'm going to hand over now to Nicole, who's put together a model to demonstrate that. Nicole.
Thank you. Yes, just enjoying some of the chat and learning about Trinidad, some of
handed
the service offerings. Fantastic. Yeah, so on the screen is a visual representation of what we've been discussing, some of the pillars that contribute to a working team, a functioning team, a thriving team, and most importantly, when times get hard, things are changing internally and externally. So these are some of the pillars. I've drawn on this from some work in nonviolent communication, and Mickey Kashdan, who is a sociologist who works with organizations. It's not actually derived from business management literature, so there might be a couple missing, but I think this is a nice overview on the screen. And I've put in green the ones that we are talking about today. So conflict management system, that's the governance processes that we've been referring to as a very important part of a pillar. And that's more about systems, whereas the effective communication skills, I'd say, is more about the individual and individual skills. So it's such a combination of personal skills and the proper systems and structures in place, as I think everybody here is very well aware. And I'd love to put a prompt into the room. You can either put it in the chat or speak out loud. Is there one or more of these pillars that you see in your organization that you really struggle with, or that your organization really struggles with, where there's a bit of a deficiency, where it could use some bolstering? Would be very curious to hear if there's a particular pillar that people struggle with. And on the next slide, if you'll fast forward ahead for me, Joanne, as you probably have all gathered, when there's cracks forming in these pillars, mediators are one of the resources who can be very helpful to repair the cracks, to help create some of those processes, which might either not even exist or they might not be very functional and operational. Yeah, thanks. And I see Simone in the chat, you're saying clear roles and overlapping roles, and I'm guessing you're saying that's one of the ones you're seeing in your organization. That's an issue. I think that's me on this piece. Anything more from Joanne or Matt on the pillars?
No, I think what the best thing is we'll go on to Matt's now going to share some examples of some organisations where particularly around that governance isn't really providing a good foundation.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. That's perfect. So what we just did there, I guess, Nicole, is speaking to an audience you're either in a community organisation work with. It's just, what do you need to do? And they're just observations, but here's what the good teams look like. So that was really valuable for me, and I found each pillar was quite amazing. But my task here is just to give you some 3 practical examples that leads into the latter part of our presentation and discussion here. We're talking about government's arrangements, but it's the systems from the pillar picture. 3 examples. The first example is a tennis club. Absolutely no provision for conflict. Don't know what conflict, defining it, nowhere near on how to handle it. Second example is a car club, which is a car enthusiast. They had some provisions for conflict, but no real practical use. And the third example is actually a couple of really large organisations that we've worked with, volunteer national organisations. So I'm going to share my screen, and what I'm going to talk to is I'm going to talk to some anonymised, if that makes sense, if that's a word, an anonymised couple of constitution documents. Just to check in, does everyone see the tennis club symbol? Okay, great. So the first example, I had a tennis club. This is their, what we call a constitution. There's other words for this. It sets up the club. And this was a neighbour conflict, very straightforward type thing from my perspective. But the organisation here has a committee. They can appoint sub. If they need to, they have some clauses, which we call the nuclear clauses, to expel people for really, really bad conduct. But there's nothing in there really that says anything about how to go about dispute and a conflict. There's general provisions. We could make a subcommittee to talk about the conflict, and then that's that. And if you do a subcommittee and it's a really big conflict that gets nasty, members of the subcommittee are identified. But really, that's the first example of a community organisation had a conflict, but there's no procedures, practices, there's nothing down. We're just playing tennis, and we hope that we don't have conflict, and we get in touch when we do. The second example was a car club. I'm in South Australia, in Adelaide. The car club, if you're a member of the car club, you get discounted insurance because you've got a classic car or some other. So therefore, there's a bit more regulation around that. And Joe will speak to a little bit more about Victoria's setups. But effectively, the government keeps a bit of an eye on some of these clubs, making sure their members' lists are accurate and up to date. And when I looked at this car club, this was a situation where there was a conflict, and it's not like I go looking at the constitution and signs of conflict. We just deal with the people and the situation. This is more of a reflective piece. But this constitution is a bit better. We've gone from 5 pages to 20 pages, and it's very much a standard type document. It's got all sorts of bits and pieces in it, but it's not really particularly brilliant on what to do in terms of mediation. Now, as a fluke, this document worked okay to a point in the conflict, because this was a conflict with a type of member, it was behavioural related, and the naughty person clause kind of worked. So there was a bit of a fluke that they had some support, but it literally meant nothing. The conflict that arose, the emotions, and all of the emotions, all of the effects of conflict that we talked to earlier were all there. The point of this was to highlight that there's not a lot of systematic support in a lot of community organisations. Now, the third example I had was we worked with 2 massive national organisations, and we resolved conflict through mediation. An honour to go in and help these people out. But they did have not only their constitution and their articles, but they also had procedures and complaint handling and policies and things like that. But there was a real disconnect between what was written and applied at what they call the head office level and what was done at the local level. So they were just 3 examples that lead back to you, Joanne, on things that we've seen And I guess the fallout of conflict is there. The opportunity that we see is that sometimes we don't like to think we're going to get into conflict, but hey, if the sun's shining, what's wrong with thinking about this in advance?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. With the conflict management system, which is what we're talking about, you may not need to change your constitution, but what's important is having the support underneath it. The getting agreement about how we do things here and turning that into something that can be handed up as people transition through the organisation. So it's really important to think about how do our systems support the process all the way through the organisation. Now, I've got the image of throwing water on a fire, which is a great strategy if it's a timber fire or certain sorts of fires, but I can tell you from experience, it's not good if it's an oil fire. And often what happens is the people appointed to resolve the conflict don't actually know the difference between the types of fires. My sons threw water on a tippy fire when someone got engrossed in a game when he was cooking chips. And so I do know from experience and the insurance claim that it has a really bad effect when people try to resolve a dispute in the wrong way. And the wrong way is often by telling people what to do, applying their own personal values and beliefs around things. What I'm wanting to highlight is, do your organisations know how to bring in someone professional or someone independent? One of the things that we often see in conflict, we pretty much always see in conflict, it's part of the nature of conflict, people will start to gather allies. And so you'll end up having various factions, cliques, gossip, all of that sort of behaviour spontaneously starting to happen, because that's what we do as humans. We seek out allies. So often there's a need for some sort of group facilitation to occur, and that's what we ended up doing in one of these large organisations to kind of do a reset to overcome what had been a really tumultuous and quite upsetting period of time. What I'm saying is a conflict management system has to have more than one button. It has to have a number of different options, and a little bit like the training that people receive if they're going to be a fire warden. It's a great idea to get some people that are like conflict wardens who know how to step in when they need to call the fire brigade and when it's something that they can facilitate a discussion and hose things down nice and early. I'm noticing the chat, but I'm not following. Is there anything that we should discuss now? I'm not going through this. Relax. Don't panic. I'm just highlighting some of the points, and it's Australian context, but all organisations that are registered in some form will have rules that are at this high. Our Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission is at the high level, and then you've got each state and territory, depending on where people are registered, has other rules. And for those of you that are joining us from other countries, I imagine there'll be some form of regulation and some basic information. The problem is they're usually written by lawyers and they're usually not really designed for that practical application.
Joanne, just one thing from the chat just to add, and if it's a great point, awareness of the system is crucial. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is, yeah, we're not going to talk to this here, but if our organisation is a dog club and we are all aware that if we get conflict that's really, really stinky and starting to, this is what we do, awareness, I think, is a really, really good point. Just awareness, because awareness leads to braveness, maybe, to have the conversation. And yeah, so thanks so much for that comment.
And it allows people to then hold management to account in terms of consistency in applying those processes or those systems as well.
Absolutely, which triggers in my mind cronyism, which is another really huge problem that can occur, whether someone's friends with the top people or not. Yeah, thank you.
The case I mentioned last month, one of the parties actually had this policy from head office, and they'd done all sorts of research, but they were like, it's so inconsistent. That there and that there. So again, another really apt comment, but it's just...
Absolutely. And in the tool that we've got, there's actually a ranking of that. Do the organisation know? Sometimes people that have the office, they might spend time preparing something that just doesn't get out. So we've just prepared to go through just very briefly, making sure that everyone's on the same page about some of these sorts of processes. And I think, yeah, that was me that was going to do that. My other claim to fame is I'm Director of Mediation Institute, where we train mediators and family law mediators throughout Australia. And also I'm a Director of the Mediator Standards Board, which is the accrediting regulating body for mediators. And it's really, I think it's really important whenever I get the chance to identify that when we're talking about mediation, we're talking about people who are trained, assessed, accredited, and maintain ongoing accreditation, so that you know that they are complying with the professional standards and ethical obligations as mediators. I've certainly heard lots of horror stories of people being told they're going to a mediation, but it's a different process being run by someone who doesn't understand how to act as an independent third party. So one of the things I think is really important in these policies and systems and processes is good, clear definitions of what people can expect when they participate in a process. If it is proper mediation, it's safe, because that's an absolute obligation of the mediator to do a preliminary assessment, make sure it is both physically and psychologically safe for people, and maintain that throughout the process, that ongoing review, confidential and respectful. My definition of respect is putting value on what's important to all of the people involved. Your definition may be slightly different, but it's really around not trying to convince one or the other that what they think is wrong, unless they clearly are in conflict with their obligations. And then it brings up the question of why. Did they not know what's expected? Do they choose not to for another reason? So lots of things can happen in a mediation, but the critical thing is often people are reluctant to engage because the last time they spoke to the person, it was awful. It's important to have some people in the organisation who can ease the way for them to think, okay, look, it's worth attempting. What's the harm in trying to resolve things in that way? This is just a little bit about how we work at ICDRS. Is we really work to try and partner with organisations so that we can build that conflict intelligence and help support building the resources that they need to be able to manage. A lot of what's happening is mediators are being seen as commodities. Like when we get to this certain point where things are terrible, we'll just call in a random mediator who knows nothing about your organisation or systems and processes, and that it can still be helpful, but it's more helpful if they understand your culture a little bit. And then, of course, there's all sorts of different services that can be provided in that sort of model. Ring up and have a chat to someone early, group facilitation. And of course, right at the very beginning, Matt talked about skills development as being an important part of what we do. And I was going to hand over to you now, Nicole, to talk a little bit about the conflict management first aid workshop.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So this is on building effective communication skills for the individuals in our organizations. And I'm actually just reflecting now, maybe this would be something that would be built into a conflict management process, like a preemptive measure. I don't know. It's just a thought that's kind of I'm curious about.
Yeah. Preventing and resolving conflict with
emphasis
on preventing.
Yeah. So with ICDRS, we offer this 2-hour online or 3-hour in-person conflict management first aid workshop to build conflict management and interpersonal skills for your team. delivered in a team environment. It can be, oh, there we go. It can be part of a dispute resolution process or be used before or after mediation. Yeah. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us. We've got in 2 weeks' times, we're doing an online 2-hour workshop of this. You're very welcome to come along. It is by donation, and reach out to us if you'd like something in person. We're in Brisbane, we're in Melbourne, and I think we've got people scattered around, maybe Sydney, elsewhere. And I've just got on the screen 4 ways of listening to a hard to hear message. We just pulled this one slide out of the workshop because it's such a great paradigm shift when we're looking at how do we communicate to people, how do we relate, especially in conflict. 4 ways of listening to a hard to hear message. In the top, you can see that we could blame others and we could blame myself. And this is, in our culture, this is typically how we approach any sort of disagreement or dispute, whether it's in the workplace or with a friend, with a partner, with family. We've been raised in this culture to be very quick to point the finger of blame, maybe with the best intentions. We want to resolve things, but blaming others or blaming ourselves and going into a shame cycle is often extremely detrimental to ourselves, to the relationship, to the other person, and honestly, to culture as a whole. It's detrimental. There is a completely different way of resolving differences in opinion and differences in strategy, and that is in the purple squares on the bottom, to start by hearing the core needs that are beneath the strategies or opinion that each party is kind of locked in and attached to. And when I say needs, I mean things like respect, as we've talked about, clarity on what my role is, clarity on what the process is, maybe reliability, because we were talking about inconsistency in processes. So we want some predictability and reliability. So when we start any sort of mediation or disagreement, when we start by really going down to that bottom level of what is needed for each person, it completely opens up people's understanding of the other party, opens up perspectives, understanding other perspectives as well as our own, and definitely softens our heart and makes us perhaps more flexible in what we're willing to do, or more creative in solutions when we really understand the needs of both parties, myself and the other person. Because often we're not even aware of our own needs. Any strategy, anything we do in life, it's a strategy to meet a need, and we're often not aware of the need. So that's just a taster of what we talk about in this workshop. Yes, it's based on nonviolent communication, if anybody knows that. So link is in the chat. And if you're interested, we'd love to see you there.
So really, I love your content, Nicole, or the content that we've developed. And I guess what you're sharing there is it goes back to the headline, preventing and resolving. I found it interesting when we've run this workshop that training works great when preventing, but then in a given workshop, there's often 1 or 2 people that are actually in the conflict and they're drawn to it. And it just makes me think of, prevention's better than cure in our community organisations. But the audience has been quite varied. We started out doing this with a local government area in Melbourne where we got a community grant for, and now we're just opening that everywhere. But really, really interesting, the people who've attended. What are your thoughts on, Nicole, on the audience and people that have attended?
Exactly like you're saying, they're coming in and they're dealing with something, and if they just get one key takeaway from this workshop, which is often understanding that the other person has needs and I have needs, they've said that's just a great first step, a very helpful first step. Yeah.
And we as volunteers get a bit of a kick out of that. So we might be talking to people on the front line that do incredible work, whatever frontline social services they're from. And they might just walk away and go, okay, well, I need to think, how am I showing up? And if they get that one thing from us, we get that joy of, okay, that's helped. We can't go into every organisation and mediate everything, and not people are ready to do that. But the one thing's always helpful for us anyway. We get our cup filled up by helping.
Yeah, but there's a QR code. We're trying to get this content out. So if anyone watching this recording from an organisation is interested in partnering or even licensing perhaps the content and being trained to deliver it, you know, those sorts of things, relations that could be had. Other gift we have for you is a free tool, a conflict management policy review tool that we've put together. I might just stop the share and open the page that QR code is going to.
The QR code takes us to a little page there where we're inviting anyone. It's no cost just to get in touch. Tell us about your little community organisation, and there you go. You've got that there, yeah. Joanne.
Yeah. So the little tool, we'll just email it out to you. It's got 12 different kind of focus areas to look at, and basically it gives you the option to grade how you think your organisation's going from we're not doing that at all. Sorry for any internationals. That's a very common Australian expression. To we've got this pretty well under control. If you think you've got it really well under control, then probably the next thing is to take it out to some of the frontline people in your organisation and see what they think. Because I think, Yvette, I think you were the one that raised the issue that sometimes what we think we've done beautifully in at the office hasn't quite got all the way through.
The other thing, Joanne, to add, when we were making this, we observed the customer, the end need. When a little community club goes through this entrenched or toxic conflict, it's really sad. The president's left, there's been fallout. We would love to have, but we also think that the organisation goes through a phase of how do we prevent this from happening in the future? What do we learn from? And that's also what we were thinking there, in that by the time an organisation, a little community organisation, has got to mediation, something's gone wrong. And mediation is a wonderful way for someone that's neutral with the right skills to get all of that. But then when the mediators have left and it's a few weeks later and the little club's going, okay, what could we do to help prevent that in the future? And a bit of healing journey as well, because that was just something to add when I thought there is a need for support after the mediation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's our formal part, and we're going pretty well with timing. I'll just put up these screens just so that they're on the recording for those that registered and weren't able to attend live. Is a program of Interact support. So that's our website and our contact page. So you can just go there if you'd like to reach out, and thank you. So any thoughts, comments? Was there anything that hopefully stood out or echoes your thoughts?
I'd just like to add a really important point was made around process.
Yeah.
And I see that in my role because I deal with conflict all the time in the HR space, and things like performance management, if there's management of underperformance, often it's just people don't understand. It's just a process. It's an uncomfortable process. No one wants to go through it, but it's just if you step it through and you follow the steps, much like the mediation process, you will get to a resolution.
Yeah.
And it's not personal. It is just the process. But people are so afraid to address the conflict. And I think a big part of it is educating people to understand that it is just a step through.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point to make. And it also goes back to that style of thinking, those four chairs that Nicole shared, because we do automatically fall into that blame thinking. But if you're going through that and you're saying, this is what we need as an organisation from you in this role, and we're able to have that conversation based on needs rather than, oh, you haven't done the right thing, it's a different conversation, very much so. Any other final thoughts or comments? I know in Australia, many of us are parts of different community organisations and associations and other groups. So maybe go and have a look and see whether there's some assistance you can provide for the organisations you're part of. And Susan, welcome. Do you have a comment?
Yes, I just want to say thanks so much for that really very succinct presentation. It's such important information, and it's really important. So many organisations I go into have let these conflicts fester for years and years and years until they have very serious workers' compensation cases that are extremely costly. And I just wanted to make the point of this early intervention and we need to tap into that, people's avoidance and organisational avoidance of conflict, and the value of going in first of all and looking at the conflict resolution policy and procedures in the organisation. I've seen some that are just absolute hieroglyphs, and there's no wonder that people can't track their way through it in a sensible way, and people are very frightened, and organisations are very risk averse in terms of even entering into the process. So somehow I think we've got a task as mediators to assist with that paradigm shift in organisations, that going way back to the 80s, conflict, what an opportunity, change, and really think about how we're inclusive in incorporating people's ideas and resolving conflict in organisations. And so I just think that entrenchment element is really important to think about when you're going into an organisation, and for organisations to think about bringing in mediators with expertise in policy development around this, in this space. Grievance and harassment policy, all of those things are all linked in together, and to get HR professionals on board with this idea of getting the prevention policies and procedures in place, which makes for a really healthy, happy workplace. And there will always be conflict. You can't just imagine that everything will be beautiful and nobody will come across conflict. So that acknowledgement that it's there, it's always there. Let's educate ourselves as an organisation about how to manage it better, and how to move with it as soon as it arises, rather than everyone's so distressed by the time they bring in an independent mediator that it's really destructive for the organisation. But thank you very much, Matt and Nicole and Joanne. That was a really, really great, very good, succinct summary. Thank you.
Thank you. And those are wonderful points that you've made. And look, particularly around the costs, like the financial cost to organisations, if they budgeted maybe just 5% of what it would cost them for, if they have a claim that goes through those sorts of processes, they would have much more money than they even need to bring in professionals for that preventative and supportive type roles. So there you go. Maybe that's what we need to make a little campaign around, getting into your budget a line item for conflict prevention or entrenched conflict prevention.
I love that idea, and thank you for such beautiful comments, Susan. But think about the money we spend on safety glasses and high-vis equipment and all that. It's really just part of that line item in your budget. It's a
basic health and safety, just giving people some skills to deal with it in the workplace.
Very, very much so. And certainly that at ICDRS, that's what we've identified, that if we can support organisations to support their people, who support the community, because certainly in Australia, community organisations are central to the whole fabric of our country. I can't imagine someone who doesn't have some sort of interaction with community organisations. And I think it's probably similar in other countries to a degree, at least. Thank you. We really appreciate your contributions and support for the presentation. As far as International Mediation Awareness Week, there's been events going on around the world and they've been recorded, so you'll be able to catch up. There's been some fabulous events that we've had this year. Hopefully, for those that have able to make it to other events, you've enjoyed them and taken something away.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you. That was really, really useful. Thank you.